The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of the station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Welcome to the Becky and Boca Show. I have Dr. Stephen Fagien with me again, MD, and he knows a lot about the coronavirus. We had a great chat a couple of weeks ago. Everybody loved it. So I wanted to check back in with you. I know you talk to all your colleagues and you talk to people all around the world that are dealing with coronavirus. And I want to know, where are we now? We're like a month into this whole thing. And is it getting better?
I think it is. I'm optimistic. Lots happened. It seems like I'm doing Thursdays with Becky now.
I know, it's great. People love listening to you. You're very reassuring.
Well, I try to be. I try to just filter out the politics, look at the reality, look at the science, not necessarily what we see here in the U.S., but what their experience has been in Europe and Asia. Right. You really can't compare the U.S. to any other place. We are huge, and we have a lot of different opinions here. When is season 2 of 2020? I don't like season 1. That's great.
It's wilder than any of those shows. I mean, who would have ever thought we would be locked down in our homes? We've been locked in our homes for about a month now, right?
Reality imitating art.
It really is.
You couldn't have made a more fearful, sometimes a horror film, fascinating, suspenseful movie. This is a equal opportunity invader. So it doesn't really care who you are. And we can talk about opening up because I think you want to know, when do you think we're going to be back in business? And I finally sent a very nice letter to my patients explaining, where we are, what the situation is, because many of them have called or texted or emailed.
What are you telling them?
The truth, we don't know. I think obviously we get closer every day, that's the obvious. But I think we're going to wind up opening up the country in a very, hopefully, carefully and thoughtful way. We need to open it up, but it needs to be done in a smart way. Time will tell. Jacksonville Beach opened up on Sunday.
And there's a flag for that. Everybody is upset about that. And I almost think it's because everybody wants to be on that beach.
I think one side would say that was just crazy. And the other side says, maybe it's a test ground to see if we really have a problem. And if we find out there's a ton of positives in Jacksonville in a few weeks, we'll know that was the wrong decision.
We'll know.
Yeah. And again, it's a personal choice with these people. Nobody was forcing them to go to the beach. And they basically, most of them were grown adults who can make their own decision. And, there's always a conflict. When you say there's a freedom of choice, that's one of them. Would I go out on a public beach now? Maybe not, but that's my choice. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're going to know anything until we start. If you wait till this goes to zero, the case incidence, you'll wait for a year and a half, because this is going to be around, in my opinion, for a while.
That's the scary part. At some point, people are going to have to decide what is worth going out and exposing yourself for.
That's right. And that becomes a personal choice. Even in my practice, my patients will have to decide, because, as I said in my letter to everyone, we will absolutely practice the safest medical care, including you wear a mask, all the staff wears a mask, we all wear gloves, no patients in the waiting room, texting you from the car when your appointment's ready. And I don't even know when that's going to start. But there needs to be, I'm on an advisor to a task force for a big plastic surgery society, the big US one, trying to figure out what makes common sense and good practices when practices like mine, or any practice for that matter in medicine, reopens. Time will tell. I think we're closed for a few more weeks. Handmaking may go away for a while.
Yeah, I think it's over for good.
I've always been a bit of a germaphobe anyhow.
Well, I was thinking, we're all going to be really good at not contracting the regular flu now, because we know what not to do. I'm thinking of all these years I've been shaking everybody's hand. And that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do.
And interestingly, in Asia, where they typically many countries don't shake hands. It's a bow and a courtesy. And in many Asian countries, they wear masks even on a normal day.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Do you think it'll come to that point in the United States where people will just continue to wear masks, at least for a year or so, right?
And maybe, it wouldn't surprise me if 5 years from now, you'll still see an occasional person wearing a mask, because that's their personal preference.
in the beginning, people weren't that scared of this virus.
Right.
But now that we've talked to people who have had it, all ages,
Yes.
it's serious business. Nobody wants to get this and just get it over with.
It's very serious. And we can get into that because I have my own biases based on some good information from some good people. It is very serious. And when they compare it to the flu, as I mentioned last time, this isn't the flu.
That makes me angry.
Now, people talk about pandemics, and we've had pandemics, and everybody's probably either seen it on TV or read about it, or somebody sent you an email, and we've had pandemics. This is a little different. This is a little different for a lot of reasons. We're only experienced mostly with flu viruses. And we've had corona type viruses, SARS and all that, and they were somewhat self-limited. This seems to be more contagious. The other thing is, unlike the flu, it's usually mostly a respiratory illness. This is not. And it affects different ages differently. It has affected people on the west coast of the U.S. different than the east coast in New York. So
why would it be? You think it's different strains?
That's one theory, that the strain from New York was a European strain, maybe more virulent. And the strain from California was mostly an Asian strain, potentially less virulent. And that's only the two that we know about. There's probably been, I assume, theoretically, there will be and has been mutations here in the U.S., but they're different. Not that you treat them necessarily differently, but it may explain, in part, the differences in New York. Now, New York is an anomaly.
Does that mean that a vaccine wouldn't work for all of them?
Don't know. And that we could talk about vaccines, because I am not that encouraged by that as being definitely a short-term solution or even a long-term solution. And some people talk about what you've heard of herd immunity. It's better, like the philosophy was, why don't we just all get it? Get over it, and we're immune to it.
You know what? I kind of bought into that until I interviewed a young man that had it, and he was 29 years old, a medical student, very healthy. He suffered for 2 full weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Night fevers, couldn't breathe, had to sleep on the floor because he had such body aches, and it sounded like torture. And he was actually in fear of not being able to breathe at one point and went and got a chest x-ray. He's 29, very healthy.
No doubt. And
that's what scared me.
Well, it tells you, why did it hit him different than another 29-year-old who's asymptomatic? And I'm sure he had no pre-existing conditions. He was completely healthy. That's what's different about this.
You thought maybe the viral load.
Viral load's very important. That's why, again, we saw this in Italy, where the healthcare providers tended to get very sick. And that's why PPE became very important, because the more you can shield about the contagion and the viral load exposed to someone who has it, who's breathing on you.
He is a medical student, so maybe there was something to that.
There's an interesting study out of Stanford, as you saw probably a few days ago, that basically tested over 3,000 people randomly and found that the positive rate for coronavirus was exceedingly high, much more than they ever would have expected, suggesting that possibly most or a majority of people in a certain population have been exposed and don't get sick.
They're saying that there may be a lot more people in the U.S. who have actually had it, yet they're saying it didn't get here till maybe January. And a lot of people were sick before that. Is it possible it was here before that?
My suspicion is it may have been, assuming that you're immune to it because you've been exposed and mount an immunologic response, is, again, that's a leap of faith. And that may not necessarily be true. So the immunologic test, I think, will be very helpful. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. As I said last time, I'm more interested
to see if we've already had it and then go out there and be safe, is what you're saying? Because that's what a lot of people are hoping for.
I think that's the first step. I'm not sure that's the answer, because it may not give us the exact information that we're looking for. I am much more interested in therapeutics. It seems in some people that some of these drugs works. And then there's always a question of timing. When are they most effective? If somebody's really in an advanced stage, it's just like anything. It's like somebody with advanced stage cancer. Chemotherapy probably doesn't do very much. Early stage, or a particular window where it might be more effective, may work. So not work, does work, is completely confusing to a lot of people as well as researchers. And I think we need to make sense out of it. Interestingly, in Asia and Italy, and we touched on this last time, they did not have the luxury of time to try to evaluate what they were doing. They got hit, and then they had to respond, and they couldn't even look at the data objectively, even though there were very good doctors in all of those areas. Here, we had a little bit of a luxury of time, maybe, where we could look at it. And as I mentioned, the American doctors, in my opinion, best in the world. Not to slam doctors anywhere else, but they look at it objectively. I spoke to a surgeon friend of mine in Hong Kong. I spoke to another surgeon yesterday who's in Milan. And fortunately, they're all doing well. I mean, I just worry. I talked to the emergency room doc here in Boca Raton today. A big shout out again to all the incredible nurses, doctors, people that sat at the desks, and the people that deliver food, the people that clean rooms.
People, aren't they?
The EMTs that pick them up at their home and bring them. I mean, these are our heroes, and I will never forget that. And I think I saw an interesting thing on a newsreel where there was an emergency room doctor in New York, first year out. He's $400,000 in debt already from school. I think there ought to be some loan forgiveness for him for being on the front line. Why not? We do it for our good military, which is deserving. They do it, it's front loaded. And I think there needs to be some consideration. And I'm not a frontline doc here in Boca Raton, and I'm certainly not an expert in coronavirus. But as you know, I was chief of surgery at Boca Hospital. I instituted some plans that people were not necessarily happy with, but was the benefit and interested in public safety. And I think this is a particular situation, and I hope that some people that are obviously smarter than me are thinking about this, where they sacrifice potentially their life to help many people. And if somebody is hurting financially, I mean, you could talk about the bailouts and the PPP and all these things, which is another whole topic of discussion. But I think for some of these nurses and doctors and medical students who now are in New York placed on the front line, there needs to be some consideration for forgiveness of this huge debt for their service to this country.
That's a great idea, Dr. Fagien.
I thought about it. I actually woke up in the middle of the night and I said, I got an idea, because I felt so bad for this guy who was really saying, and he wasn't complaining, but they had asked him, well, you're just out. What are you concerned with? Well, I'm working and I need to work, and basically I'm really in debt. And then it came out. And I think that's something we should consider.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that's a great cause.
And I think hopefully some people with influence will make those decisions. And the other thing I don't want to happen, I don't want this to wind up being a legal problem where
there are already lawsuits flying around.
It's just
that too.
I would think it would make sense if the government stepped in and said, you know what?
Protect them.
You need to protect all these people, including businesses. So somebody goes to a restaurant and 2 days later they're COVID positive. Are they going to make a claim against the restaurant where they cannot necessarily?
I'd like to see that, especially here in South Florida. You know that.
That's a tragedy, and that should not be allowed to happen. I've always been of the school of thinking that any protection is better than none. Now, there are some mouth and nose coverings that are better than others. But it depends if you believe that the small particle actually always travels to the mask and then goes inside. And that's not necessarily what happens. And
what happens?
Well, I think there is some truth to the fact that on surfaces, hard surfaces, touching it and touching your mouth. So that would protect you in many ways from that. The other thing is just a casual bystander or walking by someone who's not sneezing or coughing. There's probably some element, never been calculated, of protection of just having some mouth and nose cover.
Something over your mouth, right?
And of course, the N95 has the smallest pores, which reduces the amount of any small particles going through the mask into your nose and mouth, but not necessarily the only thing that would protect you in every way. I think they're ultimately the best. I spoke to my plastic surgeon in Hong Kong. They don't wear N95 masks. They wear regular surgical masks because they believe.
Why is that?
Well, the N95 masks, if you've ever worn one, and I have, they're very hard to breathe through. and they have a very tight fit, makes it very uncomfortable. I took one on a 3-hour flight. I could not wait to take it off. It was before the pandemic became obvious, but I knew it was coming, and I had an N95 mask, and I'm wearing it, so I did.
Okay.
A very smart leader in plastic surgery in Hong Kong said that they've kind of gone away from N95 masks because of that. They believe they get enough protection with a regular surgical mask.
From the regular surgical mask.
Some people double glove with surgery. I have for years, double masking. And you wear 2 masks.
That.
It's like 2 heads are better than 1. This is the one situation where that actually works.
That would actually work. Okay.
But so masks, gloves I think are important. Question is will we wear disposable gowns? Maybe.
What do you think about restaurants opening back up? People congregating in places like that. Well, how long do you think that's going to be?
They're already trying to do a bit of a way to social distance in a restaurant, where I've seen even in restaurants, particularly in New York, where they're trying out different table arrangements.
No, I don't need to eat out that badly. But
Well, and your level as things continue to improve, will get better and better. You may not be eating out the first month or 6 weeks that restaurants open. But as you start evaluating the data, and if people continue to do well, and there's not another spike, you may change your tune. You talked about Boca Raton. My friend who I actually spoke to, one of them this morning, who works in the ER, said it's not crazy busy. And in fact, they're seeing a lowering of the incidence of patients presenting. We get a little better every day. We will get over this. I think we've been lucky in Florida. The other thing, there was an interesting, again, it's all presumptive. We have an advantage here. If you believe in the theory, and there was a good article that we always thought that, remember, the flu season is gone mostly in the summer, and we always assumed it was from heat and humidity.
okay, is that going to have any effect on this virus?
Well, one report suggested that it does, but what I found interesting about the report, it also included heat, humidity, and light. Light appeared to affect the virus.
Wow.
Whether it's UV or anything in the broad light spectrum, is something that this is a new situation. This virus is different. One of the other things that is concerning is that there are at least some reports outside of the US, because they've had the advantage a little bit of now observing, where patients who seemingly had the virus developed antibodies to it. Small subset of them came up with the virus again.
I heard that.
Very concerning. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but it suggests to me, number one, that this is a different virus. It kind of acts like influenza, but if you think about it, it kind of acts like herpes.
Oh, so it might stay in people's system and recur.
It'd be dormant.
Ooh.
It's very concerning. And that's why, honestly, it's important not to get it. I think, and we don't know that. There's no proof at all that that's the case. But my suspicion is this is a different virus. And it's going to not behave like the other viruses. A lot of people, interestingly, have the herpes virus. So you get a recurrent cold sore on your lip, it's a herpes virus. And most of the time, it doesn't affect you until you're stressed.
It could live in your system, and then as you age, it could come back and
we don't know that. So I don't want to scare anybody. There's no evidence to suggest that it's anything like that. But we need to look at the reason. And again, the anecdotal suggestion of a recurrence or observation may be flawed. It may be, these patients never shed their virus yet. So what happens is, that's why I don't have a lot of faith yet in the immunologics and the testing. Because let's say somebody had the virus. They still have the virus. And we don't know, interestingly, a 2-week quarantine was based on old data that was given to us, and we believed it. I'm not so sure that works in everybody. And let's assume they got over it, but they were still shedding virus. So they developed an immune response, interestingly. It wasn't necessarily completely effective to get rid of all the virus yet. They tested them again, and they still had virus. So let's say you develop antibodies. Does it sustain you for life? We know that people that get vaccines it's not sustainable forever. And we know people that have had necessarily certain immunizations, with time, those immunizations tend to fade. So there's so many unanswered questions. Even that 6 feet, I mean, that's kind of a guess.
I know. I was out jogging the other day, and a car was at the stop sign, probably 20 yards ahead of me, and it squirted the windshield cleaner, hit me in the face. So I'm like,
you said, that's it, I'm getting it.
I don't believe that 6 foot thing.
Well, even I had to go to the office, and even though I had the air conditioner on, I stopped at a stoplight, and this gentleman was smoking.
You could smell it.
You could smell it, and I'm figuring, well, wait a minute.
I know.
This may not be good.
In that 6 foot rule.
Yeah, well,
when I'm at the grocery store, I feel like I'm totally vulnerable. I got to just get in and get out, be really careful because it's all over me. It's probably be a long time before movie theaters can open back up.
Yeah, I mean, movie theaters, sporting events, I think it's all going to change. I'm amazed how well people have done in general with this many weeks that we've been in isolation. People have done a pretty good job.
No, it's not. And you get used to it, and then you get into a routine that's actually kind of enjoyable. I'm doing a lot of cooking. I'm doing these videos. I'm jogging. It's not so horrible.
No, you get a little lazy. I realize it. It's one of the reasons we tend to not get a lot done when we have more time than we've ever had.
Still haven't cleaned out the garage.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I have the cleanest drawers and closets that I've ever had, and maybe for that it was a good thing. I've learned a lot. I've learned that I can be in isolation for over a month and tolerate.
I never thought I could do that.
But I think a lot of what we're seeing in the U.S. is really good news. We have learned so much so far, even with therapeutics, and now people are getting all different therapeutics, and we'll get a lot of anecdotal and clinical study information to tell us what works. As I mentioned, I think the therapeutics are going to be key. I would not base everything on immunologic cures. I think they're helpful, and it has to happen. We have flu vaccines. A lot of people, especially those that are vulnerable, need to take them. But it may not be for everybody. And I think the therapeutics, we've never really thought of therapeutics for viruses very often. Although, we have it for herpes, the Valtrex and the acyclovirs and these other drugs have been very effective. And I think the therapeutics are in many ways, people who got the flu vaccine and got the flu. And
right.
So we can't necessarily depend on it, although I think for a group of people, it's probably very effective. But I think we still need therapeutics for people that get sick. And that's why I think right now, since we don't have immunizations, we need to rely now on therapeutics. And sometimes anecdotal evidence is enough, at least for now. Trying to figure out when the trigger point is, when you give those, is going to be something up for debate for a while. And again, we don't understand this virus still. I think we will, no matter what it turns out to be. And there's all these, again, conspiracy theories, some of them which may turn out to be true. Some of them are completely bogus. But I never understood, not that I want to change the subject too much, but the theory of the wet market. If they really believed it was the wet market, why would they reopen the wet markets? It made no sense to me at all. That was in Wuhan. That was a thing. Well, and that may be, and how it escaped from the lab, we may never know. How it was communicated outside the lab, we may never know. Or even the motives, which may have been none. The leading
an accident
theory is it was an accident, which may be the answer. But the reality is the world's in a pandemic. It's not the time now to place blame. There's plenty of time for that. The time now is for us to get all the information we need and figure out a way that this can never happen again. We're all people, and we need to protect each other. There are lessons to be learned from this. One of the things about Americans is when we band together to try to solve things together, we'll be better than anybody.
Get things done. Yeah, I think I know last time we talked about how you believe that American ingenuity with the physicians treating COVID-19 is going to be what comes up with cures and treatments.
It will become the gold standard.
Okay, so we can look forward to therapeutics. We're already using some of those.
Yes.
Hopefully a vaccine.
Yes.
And getting back out there, you say maybe a couple months?
I probably short of that. I think mid-May you'll start to again, it's just a guess. Things will start to open up in mid-May. If the numbers continue and the guidelines are 2 weeks of a decline, if you start seeing rapid decline in incidence and certainly rapid decline of deaths, I think people's confidence, I think the establishment, the government's confidence, the state's confidence will be much greater, and it will be different for different places. So I tell people, don't jump to any conclusions with anything yet. Let's give it some time and see who's right, who's wrong, and then come up with some reasonable solutions. And we're going to get there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today,
Thank you,
Dr.
Becky. Good seeing you.
Very, very interesting. I know my people love hearing from you. I'm going to check back in with you and keep you in the loop so you can keep telling us what's going on. Okay.
I'll be here. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You have been watching and listening to The Becky and Boca Show. Tune in every Thursday night to discover all the ways to spoil yourself and have a good time in beautiful Boca Raton. See you next week.